the enigmatically titled Petscop.
This game is trying very hard to make it seem like there's an entity in it.
Is it really possible not to continually retread the past? Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. This is it, folks. This is the 8th and final part of my Petscop investigation series. In the previous installment, I covered videos 17 through 24 of the creepy web series known as Petscop. In this video, I'm doing a full overview and extensive analysis of the entire series. So, per usual, I need to do a little housekeeping before getting into it. First and foremost, if you enjoy my videos and want to support me on a monthly basis, you can do so for as little as $1 a month on patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. My sweet little $1 babies get early access to my podcast, Nightmare Tonight, as well as weekly updates on the status of ongoing projects. I have a number of tiers, so check it out and see what works for you. Additionally, if you'd like to support me on a one-time basis, you can do so on Ko-fi.com/Nightmare Masterclass. And, if you can't swing it right now, that's totally cool. You can still support me by liking my videos and sharing them with anyone you think might be interested. I am also very pleased to announce that I'm making an appearance on The Blood Zone, a podcast about cult art and niche culture run by Liz Ryerson. We had a really in-depth discussion about Petscop, so you're going to want to listen to that. Liz does a lot of great work, so check her out. She's got a really good one on Eyes Wide Shut. There's a link to The Blood Zone in the video description. Now, on to the matter at hand. I should call attention to the latest occurrences in the world of Petscop. The creator released an original soundtrack on November 28th, 2019. I'd strongly encourage you to check that out if you haven't already done so, because there's a little gift at the end that definitely merits your attention. Essentially, it's the final scene in the entire series. The scene begins with a child's voice similar to that of Care's voice from the sound effects played in Petscop 17. She says, "And now." Footnote. Recall that the word "now" appeared in the video description of Petscop 24. Now also appears in the menu shown at the beginning of that same video. Petscop 24 relayed information pertaining to the so-called Petscop kids. These are presumably children who have helped test the game, as the message, "Thanks for testing," is shown after all of their names appear. But what exactly does "now" mean in this context? Well, at the very end of Petscop 24, the player is shown a note from a certain someone. It begins as follows: "And now, a message from Mrs. Mark, who is working very hard as we speak." We might consider the phrase "and now" relayed in this here note and later relayed at the end of the Petscop soundtrack via the sound of a child's voice to be a special phrase intended to signify something beyond our recognition. Think of it perhaps like a special code, something you would only understand given the broader context of the code's details. Back to the video. We happen upon the player, presumably Paul, immediately after the events of Petscop 23. The once darkened plains are now engulfed in a pale bluish light. Belle approaches Paul and says, "There is Boss, waiting for her son." A large figure can be observed in the distance. Footnote. The word boss seems to have a specific meaning throughout the series, aside from its connotation as the final enemy in the level of a video game, of course. Recall that in Petscop 20, Marvin asked the tool, "Who is your boss?" At the time, Marvin had already happened upon the so-called caskets, items which pertain to certain events in the real world of Petscop. At this point, I think it's clear that Raynor was using the game to confront Marvin about a series of horrendous acts. So it's understandable why, at this point, Marvin might be on the defensive. But why would he ask the tool, "Who is your boss?" And more to the point, why did Belle use this exact same terminology when seeming to refer to Paul's mother? Back to the video. A few seconds pass and Belle continues. "Paul," she says, "do you remember being born?" Footnote. We've seen this question before. In Petscop 2, Paul came across a backwards message on the wall in Quitter's room. Its contents, "Do you remember being born?" In Petscop 7, Paul received another message in the very same spot, just below the initial question. It said, "Come here." In hindsight, it's clear that this text was written by Belle via a special capability in the game, the so-called nifty function. It would appear that Belle was attempting to initiate a line of communication with Paul. After having received this message, Paul happened upon the tool in a somewhat atypical state. Specifically, it was a glowing pink color. This is thought to be the state of the tool when Belle has taken control of it. Subsequently, the tool relayed to Paul that he needed to help Marvin find his house. But what is Belle's role in all of this? Why is she referencing the question, "Do you remember being born?" Why did she want Paul to help Marvin find his house? Back to the video. Smuggled away, driving to your new house. Boss in seat, me in back. I could not wait to be your friend. Paul replies with one single word. Family. Belle replies, "We can investigate this together." Footnote. Recall that Paul says this exact same line in a scene from Petscop 2, during which it is widely speculated that he's speaking to Belle.
But also, when you come home next month, and hopefully you're feeling a little more enthusiastic about that now, we can investigate this together. And maybe you'll find stuff that I can't find here.
Back to the video. Paul and Belle approach a large figure on the bench. The two walk towards one another. The figure obscures our view of the characters. And well, that's it. That is the very last scene of Petscop. After hours of gameplay footage, this thing is over. But wait. There's one more thing. I should note that the creator has added subtitles to the entire series. So let's clear a few things up. First off, it has been confirmed that Paul is, in fact, saying Belle's name in Petscop 22.
You there? Paul, you there? Hello?
So I think we can safely assume that the person Paul's been speaking with this entire time is, in fact, Belle. This is one point that I previously thought was going to be left ambiguous, and now it's essentially resolved. I feel accomplished. Let's back it up and head home. But wait, there's more. Check this out. So, I'm not quite sure what to make of that. Is it possible that Paul entered a car at this point in the series? If so, why? I'll touch back on this a bit later on in the video. I would first like to make a few general remarks prior to getting into the real meat of my analysis. First, I would like to reiterate that the Petscop investigation is simply my interpretation of Petscop. It is not the final word, nor is it the ultimate meaning of the work. The reason I am reiterating this now is because I don't want to dissuade others from presenting their own interpretations, especially now that Petscop is complete. As I've said before, the most interesting works of art often produce a vast multiplicity of interpretations, and I think that is very clearly the case with this series. So, even if your interpretation differs wildly from mine, that's okay. I'd still like to hear from you. I found that every step of the way throughout this whole process, there have been things I've missed or perhaps misinterpreted, and it is really helpful to hear alternative views. Additionally, I just want to make it clear that I have never made a claim about the intentions of Petscop's creator, nor do I intend to do so in this video. I don't know him. I don't have access to his psyche. This is my reading of the work, plain and simple. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, let me talk about my game plan here. My goal with this video is to analyze the broader themes of Petscop in light of these final videos, and spell out exactly what I think the work is doing in terms of its effect on the viewer. I'm going to be doing a fair amount of synthesizing here, so if you haven't watched my previous investigation videos, well, I'm not going to say it's absolutely necessary for our purposes here, but if you want additional context, feel free to revisit them. I will present evidence within the series to support my various claims, but I should mention up front that this is basically my best guess at what the hell is going on in this series. Additionally, I will be citing a number of philosophers and other thinkers all throughout this video. Please don't worry if you aren't familiar with the ideas presented, or even if you haven't heard of these various figures. I will do my very best to provide the context necessary in order to understand the various points I make in the course of my analysis. However, I'd urge you to read works by these people yourself. You don't need to take my word for it when I present an interpretation of their ideas. You can do some exploring and come to your own conclusions, and I strongly encourage that. Please take a look at the various references I've supplied in the video description. I've included a number of fairly digestible videos that you may find useful. I think you'll find that Petscop is itself an abstract work of art, so I would say the appropriate way to understand it is not by going around the storm, so to speak, but directly through it. So, batten down the hatches. One might say that Petscop is an artful meditation on the nature of trauma, particularly in a family setting. Then again, one might say that Petscop is an artful commentary on the nature of systems and their impact on individuals, particularly children, the most vulnerable people in any system. One might even say that Petscop, the work, uses the video game Let's Play format to illustrate the manner in which ideology narrows our perceptual horizons, influences our behavior, and very much shapes our lives in ways that are often beyond our own immediate awareness. Petscop can, of course, be thought of as a commentary on the subjective experience of playing a video game, specifically one fraught with nostalgic elements and, consequently, a certain kind of ideological baggage. There's a sense in which I would say that, yes, each of these things are true, but at the end of the day, I don't believe Petscop has one cohesive meaning, per se. Rather, it has a generative potential. The work lends itself to being analyzed in a number of frameworks, and it lends itself to a multitude of possible interpretations. I mean, that's what's great about it. It poses questions rather than providing the answers for you. And the central question of Petscop is extremely important, so listen up. Is it possible to come back after having experienced some traumatic event? As stated, Petscop doesn't answer this question. Rather, the function of the work is to get you to ruminate on it. Petscop, the work, builds artfully towards a 21st century subjectivity, one rife with unspoken trauma, unresolved threads, ambiguous identities, and arbitrarily complex relations. And formalization has come into play with respect to the work's complexity. Petscop is complex and impossibly difficult to unravel because it's attempting to interrogate in an artistic fashion an impossibly difficult subject, the abuse and mistreatment of children. Petscop is the formalization of the condition one might be left in after having been subject to abuse in the early stages of development. Abuse messes with your head. It conditions you to expect horrible things around every corner. And that's precisely the effect created by Petscop. It's remarkable in its ability to continually evoke a sense of impending doom. And of course, it's important to note that Petscop, the video game, is decidedly not an organic system. It's an artificial one. Petscop is the realm of the virtual, and as I'm sure you're painfully aware of by now, Petscop is a game that was, at least in part, designed by a person who goes by the moniker Rainer. If there is a critique to be offered of the game's internal system, that is to say, the various rules upon which the game itself operates, it stands to reason that Petscop, the work, might have something to say about the nature of such constructs. Not just video games, mind you, but also the various human-made systems that shape our very own world. As for the creator of Petscop, the game, well, I think it's fair to say there's quite a bit of textual evidence that seems to indicate a distinct connection between Rainer's psychology and the game itself. So, Rainer's motivations will be thoroughly unpacked in this video, and his apparent state of mind will play a very important role in my analysis. The work doesn't make it clear exactly who Rainer is, but a strong case can be made that it is, in fact, a person named Daniel, in all likelihood, one Daniel Hammond. Now, I have previously speculated that the events of Petscop take place in the context of some kind of family setting, and yet the ambiguity with respect to familial relations is another key theme of the work. We can perhaps understand Rainer's motivations by referring to a very few important letters shown at various points throughout the series. In these letters, Rainer seems to be taunting a person named Marvin. Based on my understanding of the series, Rainer designed Petscop in order to achieve some kind of catharsis. Perhaps he believed that he would be able to make Marvin answer for his crimes. However, based on my understanding of the work, this catharsis was not achieved. Thus, Rainer's fate in the bathroom is a result of his failure to accomplish what he set out to do with his uncanny PlayStation game. The product? Well, I think it's perhaps best to understand Petscop the game as an impressionistic view of Rainer's surroundings. His time and place, which at this point I think we can safely assume was a relatively small suburban town within the United States, specifically somewhere in Connecticut, during the mid to late 90s. This is why I have previously emphasized the time period in which Petscop the game was created within the fictional world of the series. The work relies upon the nostalgia evoked by its aesthetic presentation. I would argue that this presentation as a video game from the 90s is absolutely critical to the work's underlying meta-narrative. Petscop uses nostalgia to lure the viewer into a false sense of security. This nostalgia is then turned against the viewer in order to elicit horror. It creates an uncanny sort of dissonance, if you catch my drift. To be sure, the very concept of a generation is fraught with problems. After all, who's to say where you draw the line between one generation and the next? Nonetheless, for a certain age group, I would say, largely millennials, people born roughly between the years 1981 and 1996, playing an old PS1 game might create a warm, familiar sensation. It reminds us of our childhood. And then, all of a sudden,
This is a little more than I was expecting to see. That's a dead kid.
that canny sense of childhood is completely and utterly subverted through the use of a single image, an unmistakably tragic signifier. Petscop snaps us out of that nostalgic trance and gives us a dead child, the epitome of an untimely death. In an immediate sense, there aren't many ways to interpret such an obviously horrible thing. If we have a dead child on our hands, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. And yet, we never quite get a definitive answer to the question of how exactly Michael Hammond died. It is one of many unsolved puzzles which plague investigators to this day. While Petscop's presentation is certainly unique, this is not the first time nostalgia has been used in this manner. In David Lynch's Blue Velvet, nostalgia is elicited through the use of Norman Rockwell-esque Americana, but this warm sensation of nostalgia turns suddenly into gut-churning horror when our protagonist finds a severed ear on the ground. The context is entirely different, but the effect is essentially the same. Nostalgia is transformed into horror through the use of an unmistakable yet causally ambiguous signifier. A certain kind of duality is suggested in Blue Velvet, as well as, for that matter, pretty much every work in Lynch's filmography. On one hand, there is the picturesque depiction of American life, its ideals, embodied within the very aesthetic of the film. On the other hand, there is the seedy underbelly, the nightmare realm, in which unspeakable acts take place, in which the American dream, the very possibility of a good life, is effectively rendered null through the sheer wickedness and depravity perpetuated by those who operate in this space. Is it possible to pass through this space while maintaining some semblance of, well, goodness? So too does this kind of duality exist within Petscop. As I've noted in earlier parts of the investigation series, the bright, cheery artifice of the gift plane is heavily contrasted with the darker portions of the game, the subsurface, in which the death of a child is casually alluded to, and in which, if one bothers to pay extremely close attention, the mechanisms of dehumanization are laid bare. And so, it is only logical that understanding these mechanisms, perhaps by tracing their various effects back to some underlying cause, might well be one access point through which the broader work can be understood. Petscop continually emphasizes the manner in which the past influences the present moment. Let's revisit this notion of recordings having the power to raise the dead. In a sense, the wistful sort of nostalgia evoked over the course of the series can be understood in this context. Take, for instance, Care's dancing scene. When we understand the scene in the immediate, that is to say, as it happened at the time, we can appreciate it as essentially a novelty. It's a scene depicting a girl dancing to an Ace of Base song, an immensely popular song at the time of the initial gameplay session. In a series filled with cryptic references, family secrets, and increasingly disconcerting textual clues, this scene appears to be a fun little reprieve of sorts. Indeed, many Petscop aficionados have interpreted the 21st video strictly in those terms. That is to say, they figured it was simply a nice send-off for this particular batch of videos. A clever nod to fans, nothing more. However, when we understand the scene as a recording, and remember, recordings have the power to raise the dead, it becomes clear that something more is going on. When we talk about about recordings having the power to raise the dead, what I don't want to convey is some kind of undead or zombie type thing. Rather, I would like to think about raising the dead in a bit more of a biblical sense. I'd like to discuss a certain way of reading scripture. The theoretical foundation for this sort of reading is rooted in something called typology. A typological interpretation seeks to ascribe significance to a perceived type in the work. Christ served as a special antitype for those seeking to interpret scripture, one which can be used to cross-reference earlier sections, possibly to find an earlier type, a person and or series of events which prefigures the antitype. In the case of Christ's resurrection, we might well hearken back to the Old Testament's Jonah, a figure who quite aptly serves as a kind of type for Christ's antitype. Just as Christ was resurrected after being crucified, Jonah emerged from the belly of a whale, which was thought to have eaten him. In the typological understanding of the Old Testament in relation to the New Testament, Jonah's story foreshadows the destiny of Christ himself. A savvy thinker might well employ the schema of typological interpretation to Petscop in order to try and make sense out of the work. When Paul happens upon Care NLM's description, there's a very curious line at the end. You're the new maker, you can turn Care NLM into Care A and close the loop. This raises a number of questions. What is the new maker? What type of qualities does the new maker possess that makes them equipped to close the loop, so to speak? What does it even mean to close the loop? As you might expect by now, I don't believe Petscop sets out to provide concrete answers to these questions. With the employment of vaguely archetypal terms such as, for instance, new maker, its real-world referent aside, there does seem to be some basis for an understanding of Petscop which hinges upon the specific types presented to us. There are several challenges to forming a typological interpretation of Petscop. First and foremost, the work is not divided into two parts like the Old and New Testaments of Christianity. Rather, it is comprised of short videos in the guise of something akin to a Let's Play series. This is just one confounding factor. How can we make sense of the work in terms of types and antitypes when there's so much complexity to consider? Well, in truth, the Bible is pretty complex, and nonetheless, theologians and scholars derive meaning from the text, or rather, I should say, this series of texts which is bound together through historical circumstances. But is this practice really worthwhile? It's true that theologians have done a fair amount of mental gymnastics to contextualize the Old Testament in relation to the new one. And of course, there are theologians in the Judaic tradition that certainly do not centralize Christ in their understanding of Jonah's story. Simply put, there are other ways of seeing things. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche argued that Christianity had led to some very, let's just say, flawed ways of understanding the world. Nietzsche believed that certain ways of reading scripture had become ingrained, and the ubiquity of such readings has had a deleterious effect on society as a whole. I would say that the major flaw is looking at the past strictly in present-day terms, rather than historically and in Nietzsche's own terms, genealogically. This applies not just to literal events, but also the sorts of stories told in the Bible. It's also important to understand Nietzsche's philosophical framework. In the introduction to On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche wrote, "An aphorism properly stamped and molded has not been deciphered just because it has been read out. On the contrary, this is just the beginning of its proper interpretation. And for this, an art of interpretation is needed." For Nietzsche, there is no fact of the matter that is independent of its interpretation. Thus, interpretive frameworks are critically important from a Nietzschean perspective. On the topic of rebirthing as a practice, it does seem to me that this particular way of thinking is rooted in a certain religious mode. Perhaps more specifically, it's a Christian mode. I say this as a lapsed Christian myself. The idea of a baptism or perhaps even resurrection, these are the things that inevitably come to mind when you try to analyze Petscop at the level of the text. But unlike Nietzsche, I won't pin the blame on any one particular religion. After all, rebirth and resurrection are certainly not topics discussed exclusively in the Bible. Rather, I'd like to suggest that the problem comes from literal readings of what are essentially metaphysical texts. So we've considered an interpretive approach rooted in typology, and I personally think that while the work itself may allude to typology in the way that it employs certain terms, such as new maker or guardian, just for instance, such an approach as a whole ultimately comes up short in terms of its potential to explain Petscop. So one might ask, what other approaches are available to us? What framework might we use to provide insight on Petscop? Well, we might, in the spirit of Nietzsche, try to employ a genealogical approach. That is to say, we might attempt to uncover the origin of certain practices that can be observed in the work, and we might attempt to understand the conditions that have allowed for the possibility of such practices. And we might seek to understand the conditions that shape the discourse about such practices. And of course, such an inquiry necessarily entails an inquiry into language itself. Petscop, the work, concerns itself intimately with matters of language, and so our investigation of the work necessarily entails an investigation of language itself. Language is the object of study in structural linguistics, a school of thought which posits that language is a self-contained structure composed of various elements. The framework of structural linguistics, sometimes simply referred to as structuralism, understands the formal characteristics of language as a network of particular signs. Analyzing Petscop from a structural standpoint might well provide a basis for understanding the work strictly in terms of the signs generated and further developed by it. One might say that the narrative itself is composed of these very signs. Moreover, from a structuralist standpoint, I'd argue that their interrelation is where the magic really starts to happen. In structuralism, the sign is the unit of language itself. A sign consists of two essential components, the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the word itself, or rather the sounds used to form a word, as well as the specific markings to identify the word in writing. The signified is the concept that the word is thought to convey. This is the entire basis of structural thought, first articulated by a Swiss linguist and semiotician named Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure believed that any given language demonstrates certain features, which can be subject to analysis. He thought that a given language could be understood as a system. In Course in General Linguistics, Saussure noted, language is not a function of the speaker, it is a product that is passively assimilated by the individual and never requires premeditation, and reflection enters only for the purpose of classification. That is to say, language is not one's own. It operates by certain conventions. Let's take, for instance, the word casket. The sounds which, in English, signify a fancy box used to hold a person once they've shuffled off this mortal coil, so to speak. Oh hell, let's dispense with the pleasantries. A casket is used to hold a dead person. One particularly interesting feature of language is that it functions, in most cases, despite the absence of an obvious referent. I don't need to manifest a literal casket in front of you in order for you to know what I'm talking about when I say the word casket. More often than not, the referent is completely absent. A naive positivist understanding of language is such that words refer directly to things in the external world. However, the key structuralist insight is that words, such as casket, are defined primarily via their differential relation to other words in the system that constitutes the entire language. A casket is a casket precisely because it's not a chair, or a bed, or a lamp, or a door, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, there's no essential connection between casket, this brief sequence of sounds, or these crude markings, and the idea, the concept itself, which is called a mind when the word casket is spoken. The fact that we use casket to refer to the notion of a casket is entirely a matter of historical circumstances. Thus, the relationship is arbitrary. No supreme being handed us the term casket from above. It is just as much an accident of history that we have inherited the word casket as it is that Elvis Presley died on a toilet. These two things are both contingent upon historical circumstances. In another time, another place, another context entirely divorced from our own, the utterance casket might well come to mean something else entirely. In such a case, the signifier would be imbued with an altogether different signified. One might even use the signifier as a token rather than your run-of-the-mill word. In programming terms, the lexical token consists of a token name and a token value. It's a series of characters with an assigned meaning. For instance, here we have a series of token names along with a few potential token values. We have operators which are used to relay information pertaining to the relation of one value to another. And then we have literals, which can be a number of value types, such as truth values, numeric values, and strings. And then we have comments, which serve as notes to the people working on the program. In the case of Petscop, it is strongly suggested that Rayner has implemented the term casket as a token name used in the game to represent a specific category of items. These items are associated with one another insofar as they relay key information to a relevant party. Various bits of context are provided to Marvin relating to each item. Another potential commonality is that the work suggests these items have been censored in previous videos. But what do these token values really convey? Each seems to present its own potential mystery. What do these mysteries have in common with one another? Why have they been grouped together in this manner? What is the commonality between these items in terms of content? Based on the information presented to the audience, it's not at all clear. This is the mystery of the casket. Rayner's token phrase in the system he's devised specifically for the game Petscop Petscop. We certainly cannot expect to fully cohere this entire system. Rather, what Petscop, the work, shows to the audience is the impression of a system, rather than a fully fleshed out system that we can dissect at our leisure. Another unique feature of language is that it can often function not only in the absence of the reference of the concept to which signifiers refer, language can also function in the radical absence of the speaker. For instance, I can stick a post-it note on my food in the fridge at work in order to signify to my coworkers that this food, in fact, belongs to me. Signs are used in fast and loose ways such as this all the time. The important thing to keep in mind here is this message functions despite the fact that I am not present in the break room when they read it. The note still does its job even though I'm not there. But let's now consider the possibility that I'm a bit of a fucker. See, what I've done here is swapped around the brown bags and placed the post-it note on a lunch that is not, in fact, my own. Pretty sneaky, sis. So I am signaling to my coworkers that this here lunch is mine, despite the fact that it is not, it's someone else's. Nonetheless, the note functions based on the signs presented in the note despite my absence. Now, let's say I get hit by a bus prior to getting a chance to eating that person's lunch. How tragic. I was looking forward to that sandwich. At any rate, the note still functions as though I am alive, at least until someone realizes that a deceased person's lunch has been sitting in the fridge. It'll probably start to smell a bit. Maybe one of my coworkers will realize that one of my very last acts on this planet was to steal their lunch. It doesn't really matter. Intentionality is no longer a factor since, I'm no longer around in this hypothetical to explain my intentions with respect to the post-it note. And importantly, and this is the main thing I'm trying to get across here, words have their function regardless of the speaker's intentions. If we're to take the premise of Petscop, the work, seriously, it would seem that the game is functioning in the radical absence of this Rainer, a character I have theorized to be the game's developer. Rainer is presumed to be long gone by the time that Paul, the protagonist of the series, starts to play the game. Perhaps the game isn't functioning in the way that Rainer originally intended. We can't really know for sure since Rainer is not an active presence in the setting of Petscop. Rather, I will assert here that radical absence is a distinct quality of the work, both with respect to Rainer in relation to Petscop the game, and with respect to the creator in relation to Petscop the series, prior to the artist revealing himself, of course. The question of who created Petscop the series was largely just another mystery in the innumerable series of mysteries conveyed in the work. This is a fortuitous scenario for critics such as myself who seek to analyze and make sense out of the work, as the general view of the work has no chance of being influenced by the creator. For the majority of the time people have been trying to interpret Petscop, the creator has simply not been part of the equation. Rather, the creator's absence is a quality of the work. How does this radical absence function? What does it serve to demonstrate? Well, let's consider for a moment the apparent fact that our very own systems and institutions were, in fact, made by fallible people, just like Petscop was made by Rainer. So, understanding the various tensions that occur at the level of the game may well provide some insight with respect to our own world. Let's recall the very elaborate system by which language is conveyed in Petscop. A number of Petscop aficionados have put in a good amount of time and effort to decode this system. I'm not going to lay out all of the nuts and bolts here, but I am going to note some of the interesting features of this language system. The manner in which particular identities are acknowledged via this system is one of the more notable qualities, and I think it speaks to one of the underlying themes of Petscop. Recall that Paul is acknowledged as Pall, P-A-L-L, which means a cloth spread over a coffin, hearse, or tomb. Further, recall that Bell is acknowledged as Bell, B-E-L-L. Note that the E is missing at the end of her name. I have previously offered a rationale for this phenomenon, which I believe holds water. To be brief, the system simply does not recognize proper names. It wasn't built with that in mind. So the player must use approximations, words that exist within the parameters of its lexicon. Words that fall outside of the scope of the game are basically equivalent to gibberish. It's like me trying to put out an analysis video called like, come on, Dave. No one will go for that. That's not anything. At face value, this might not seem particularly interesting, save for perhaps the cryptic connotations of Paul's approximation. As I previously noted, a pall is a cloth that you spread over a coffin. So yeah, that's definitely a cryptic reference. But there's more to the subtext of Petscop's language system than just that. Let's further note that occasionally the player gets this weird not in table error. It stands to reason that this is the type of message one gets when they've entered a series of inputs that the computer cannot recognize. Of course, whenever this is experienced in the game, it introduces a bit of ambiguity into the work. That is to say, it raises the question of what specifically the player is trying to articulate. And we can speculate about each case, but the more interesting question to me is, what does this recurring phenomenon say about the work as a whole? What can be found outside the fixed expressions of the game's language system, its lexicon? We might call these things which cannot be articulated the emotional truths of lived experience, which, of course, is a constituent of subjectivity itself. There's an interesting question being raised here about the difficulty to communicate and perhaps even the impossibility of certain things to be articulated in a given circumstance, especially when one is a child with a limited vocabulary. Of course, the same logic applies to adults as well. Consider this. What if your native language simply doesn't have a word to express the specific emotion you're feeling? Like, there's not an English word that's analogous to the German word Schadenfreude, which means the experience of deriving pleasure from another person's misfortune. For Germans, does the fact that there is a word for such a concept actually serve to legitimize or perhaps even reify the concept of Schadenfreude in their culture? I believe it probably does, but then again, I'd say that while it's not in common usage here, the term has entered the English lexicon as well, and this probably has had certain effects in English-speaking countries. I wouldn't say this makes a particular culture more prone to feeling Schadenfreude, per se. It's more so that giving a name to such a complex emotion serves to validate it as a concept. And so, what is Petscop the work really saying about Paul, our protagonist? The game doesn't even recognize his name. Other players have to use a mere approximation, an approximation which, oddly enough, seems to allude vaguely to the concept of death. There's a sense in which we might say that through a certain kind of sin of omission, the game invalidates his very existence. Doesn't it seem as though the work is suggesting something about language's role in matters of identity? You'll notice that whenever we get into these types of discussions, that is to say, discussions about language itself, things can get convoluted fairly quickly. Why is this? Well, for starters, we're using language to discuss language, which is a bit paradoxical, don't you think? Can a system that is used by humans to convey meaning really be used to make meaning out of itself? When one extrapolates the underlying precepts of structuralism to their conclusion, one finds that the relationship of signs, the network of signs which constitute language itself, presents something of a conundrum for those looking for some notion of philosophical significance. After all, what is it that happens when you look up a particular word in the dictionary? You find more words, right? More signifiers? And what happens when you look up those words in the same dictionary? Well, you're just going to find more signifiers, aren't you? Language, then, is self-referential. Poststructuralism is a series of trends, which some say constitute a school of thought that exists in opposition to structuralism. It's probably more accurate to say that poststructuralism is a loose series of trends by thinkers such as Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, not to mention Judith Butler and Jürgen Habermas. Primarily, while structuralism regards language as a closed system, the key post-structuralist insight is that there's an insurmountable gap between the signifier and what was referred to by Saussure as the signified. The late David Foster Wallace described post-structuralism as follows. The deconstructionists or post-structuralists mean the same thing, by the way. Post-structuralist is what you call a deconstructionist who doesn't want to be called a deconstructionist. See the debate over the ownership of meaning as a skirmish in a larger war in Western philosophy over the idea that presence and unity are ontologically prior to expression. There's been this long-standing deluded presumption, they think, that if there is an utterance, then there must exist a unified, efficacious presence that causes and owns that utterance. The post-structuralists attack what they see as a post-Platonic prejudice in favor of presence over absence and speech over writing. We tend to trust speech over writing because of the immediacy of the speaker. He's right there, we can grab him by the lapels and look into his face and figure out just exactly what one single thing he means. But the reason why post-structuralists are in the literary theory business at all is that they see writing, not speech, as more faithful to the metaphysics of true expression. For Barthes, Derrida, and Foucault, writing is a better animal than speech because it is iterable. It is iterable because it is abstract, and it is abstract because it is a function not of presence but of absence. The reader's absent when the writer's writing, and the writer's absent when the reader's reading. For a deconstructionist, then, a writer's circumstances and intentions are indeed part of the context of a text, but context imposes no real cinctures in the text's meaning because meaning in language requires cultivation of absence rather than presence, involves not the imposition but the erasure of consciousness. This is so because these guys, Derrida following Heidegger and Barthes Mallarmé and Foucault, God knows who, side note from David Stockdale here, Foucault following Nietzsche, see literary language not as a tool but an environment. A writer does not wield language, he is subsumed in it. Language speaks us, writing writes, etc. Some wise words from my problematic fave there, although I'm not exactly sure why he constantly refers or assumes that the writer is a he, chauvinist jackass, anyway. At any rate, if we take this post-structuralist view seriously, if it's really the case that writing writes us, language speaks us, what does that say about the video game? We need to consider the video game, as an extension of one's social environment. Is it the player that plays the video game, or is it the game that plays the player? Petscop gradually builds up its own symbolic language over time. I would argue that the primary function of the work is to call into question this very language. First, the work suggests a link between the gift plane and its subsurface, the darkened plains and subterranean areas in which a preponderance of ominous signifiers exist. And through this implicit connection, Petscop works to draw the viewer into a world built upon what would appear at first glance to be a plethora of logical puzzles. But over the course of the series, these elements begin to present more questions than answers. This is maddening to some viewers, and it's precisely what attracts others to the work. I will assert here that the logical, puzzle-solving element of Petscop is a phantom. There is no transcendental signified that leads us to the truth of the matter. When one attempts to search for a signified, what they find is simply more signifiers. There is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There is simply a network of floating signifiers, some of which seem fairly innocuous and some of which seem really quite ominous. Complexity, or inscrutability, I should say, is an essential feature of the work, and some seem to have mistaken this for a flaw, something that is detrimental to the quality, as it were, of the work, in terms of its artistic merit. I strongly disagree. The immense difficulty of learning the truth of the matter, as it were, is a defining theme of Petscop. This sort of conclusion might feel unsatisfying to some viewers. One might place this entire series in the same category as a movie in which the entire story is revealed to be a dream at the end. Doing so is a category error, in my view, because from the very start, Petscop the work has never created the expectation that we are going to get some concrete, finalized picture of the events alluded to. That expectation is something viewers have brought into it themselves. This is part of the reason why I have discouraged people from thinking of Petscop like a conventional TV series. If you are left unsatisfied by the idea that we'll never learn the precise truth of the matter in relation to Petscop, I would like to humbly suggest that, again, radical absence is a key element of the work, and this is true with respect to the story itself. The narrative vacuum that is brought about as a result of all of these unresolved threads is what defines Petscop. Without this vacuum, Petscop would not be what it is. The work problematizes its very own symbolic language in order to demonstrate how we can problematize the underlying precepts behind the various symbols and signs we come across in everyday life. In this sense, ambiguity is used in a totally consistent manner throughout the series. You're obviously free to believe whatever you want, but if you come at me with some spiel about plot holes or continuity errors, congratulations, you've missed the point of this investigation series. Go back and rewatch the entire thing. I'm kidding, of course, but seriously, if plot holes are your primary concern at this point, I would humbly suggest that you're missing the forest for the trees. Rather than thinking of this work as the singular vision of a creator trying to present some kind of unified message, think of it instead like something akin to a collage, an impressionistic series of snapshots. The story may be convoluted, and there may very well be a number of threads in the story that are left unresolved by the end of the series, but calling into question the various precepts that compose the order of our existence is something the work continually excels at. So, by this metric, I deem the work a success. There's a sense in which certain actions taken by the player in a video game can be understood as performative. I'm using the term performative here in a very specific philosophical sense. And it's important to distinguish between the simple act of performing, which I do believe takes place in the game as well, and an act that is outright performative. Philosopher J.L. Austin used the term performative to describe a certain type of behavior. In particular, Austin was focused on the philosophy of language. He described the term performance utterance as a type of speech that goes beyond mere speech. Rather, it constitutes a conscious action in and of itself. When a speech act is performative, that means it has certain consequential effects. For instance, when the bride and groom say "I do" at their wedding, they're entering into an agreement to be married. When a police officer says "you have the right to remain silent," they're reading someone their Miranda rights, which is legally necessary in order for the police to question you. These are explicitly performative speech acts, but there are also implicitly performative speech acts as well. Basically, every time you reinforce a certain concept with your speech, there's a sense in which that's a performative act. Philosopher Judith Butler famously expounded on the concept of performativity in relation to gender. According to Butler, we act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or simply something that is true about us. Actually, it is a phenomenon that is being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. There is a common conception that speech is somehow less consequential than other actions. Let's call to mind the phrase, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me." There's a sense in which, yes, of course, this saying has validity. It's true that speech acts in a narrow, strictly individual sense are generally less consequential than other actions, such as explicit violence. Calling someone a shithead is less damaging than punching them in the face. I think that's a statement we can all agree with. It is nonetheless true that language is often used in ways that tend to reinforce certain societal dynamics which may well prove to result in violence. Just a quick content warning here. We are going to discuss transphobia in the context of performativity. So if that seems like something you want to skip, I will include timestamps in the video description and you can just go to the next part. For instance, there are some assholes out there who refuse to use a transgender person's pronouns. So I would say that's a prime example of a speech act which has consequential effects. Namely, it reinforces transphobia. And of course, transgender people are subject to myriad abuses in our society, unfortunately, and they have been relegated to a marginalized position. This is something we should fight against with every fiber of our being. And at the risk of getting a little flack from the gamers, I think the same exact thing can be said of video games. The contents of a particular game might well serve to reinforce certain harmful dynamics. And I would argue that Petscop, the work, supports this general view. Let's consider the message Paul receives in Petscop 5. First, Paul is directed to, quote, turn PlayStation off, after which he is told, Marvin picks up tool, hurts me when PlayStation on. The work is alluding to unseen violence, which occurs as a result of a presumably harmless act, playing a video game. By mere virtue of the fact that a goddamn PlayStation is turned on, someone is getting hurt. There's harm being done beneath the surface of this virtual world. It seems to me that the basic act of playing a game constitutes some kind of performative act in the world of Petscop. It has implications in the real world in which Petscop takes place. It reinforces certain violent dynamics. But the claim that video games may, depending on their contents, serve to reinforce harmful dynamics is not quite the same thing as saying that video games cause violence. I don't believe that. In truth, video games are just a small slice of the pie that constitutes the social environment of a player. So, in my last comment response video, I was asked what I thought of the whole Paul is transgender theory, and I expressed that I believe the work is ambiguous about the matter at the level of the text. Subsequently, I asked trans people to weigh in on the matter since I could very well be missing something, and I received a considerable amount of replies. Not surprisingly, there were indeed quite a few things that didn't occur to me. So I just wanted to relay these comments directly to my general viewership. Thank you to everyone who shared their thoughts. I really found these various interpretations to be fascinating. Jezared says, I suppose I'll throw my hat into the metaphorical ring here. Hello, I'm a trans woman, and I have a few opinions. To the point, though, I can see that this theory has legs, but I personally don't follow it. Paul being trans has never had a direct reference or key phrase or anything I can point to as someone who has had that experience and go, yeah, I've heard that before. Rebirthing seems like a key theme and can certainly be interpreted as such, but I think that the work's focus on childhood trauma is the main point, and due to the very real presentation of what it's like to live with abusers, trans people, many who have had a rough childhood because of being trans, can connect to the work through that theme, and it means that they see things that relate to their experience, as can many others who have suffered abuse. I think the fact that trans people can relate says a lot about the way Petscop depicts trauma and abuse. There's a little bit of everything there that people who have lived in different abusive situations can say, I've lived through similar. The fact that this extends to trans people says a lot about the strength of the work, especially due to the link between being trans and being more likely to suffer through abuse because of it. Rebirthing, to me, feels more like a part of the world that we're peering into here than a metaphor for anything, if that makes sense. I'm not saying that it can't be used in interpretations, but it seems like more of a plot element to me than part of the message. But that's just my interpretation, and I am but one person who knows her brain doesn't quite work like others. Hope this helps in any case. Thank you, Jezared. Beal Cypher's animation says, Transmasculine person here, I went back through Petscop to pass along some interesting details about connections to some transgender themes and came back with an even more interesting detail on accident. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only pronouns ever used for Belle/Tiara are that guy over there and they are gone, in reference to the Tiara character in Quitter's Room. We've all been assuming that Belle/Tiara is a girl, but I'm not sure there's ever once an instance where they are referred to as female in Petscop. I found this an interesting detail to find because avoiding direct pronouns is often something we in the queer community do in our writing, as well as it being a clever way to trick us as consumers of said media by playing on our tendency to assume the gender of a character based solely on context, name, or appearance. So, Tiara might not be a girl? Now, what I originally came here to tell you was about Paul. A couple of notes. Paul was not able to go into the office in the school when the letters G-I-R-L were floating in front of him. Instead, he was able to enter when these words no longer existed. Even the game seems to think it's been calling Paul the wrong thing, as he's unable to enter at first. Second note. When Paul returns home for the birthday party, they tell him he's not lost to stop wandering and come home. These particular words rung with me as they're often something Southern families will say, but not in a kind way, to queer family members. Just a side note from me, Dave here, I'm sure this happens in the North as well. The sort of thing where they think you're just off finding your identity because you don't really know what's going on. Oh, you're just a teenager. You're just lost, but you'll come home back to your senses and realize who you are / what family you belong to. Of course, I love Petscop for its ability to be interpreted in many ways, and appreciate in the same way that even if I see Care as an abused kid who grew up and got away so he could transition and be free to be who he wants to be, others can probably view the story in some other way that allows them to make it through their own trauma. Thank you, Beal Cyphers. Puck Bryn says, "You're not at all transmask NB here." Just a side note from Dave. NB is it means non-binary people. I don't want to repeat what other people have said, so this might seem sort of curt, but the fragmented nature of the work in general, the inconsistent timeline, I have trouble remembering things in order. The concept of different and distinct generations and stages of development just reminded me of my experience and the way memories feel so jagged and broken apart depending on what lie I was telling to myself at the time. But also, no matter if it was intended or not, or if it pisses people off, I wonder which kind of people, certainly not the ones who already hated trans people. It was really nice to have representations of those feelings that are so hard to put words to. Excellent. Thank you, Puck Bryn, for sharing that. Thank you, Pete says, to me, as a trans guy watching the series, the whole rebirthing process stood out to me. It made me think of how people transition from one gender to another. It's always a little nagging detail that I've kept in the back of my mind. Something else I've noticed, and this is in no way trying to make fun of Paul, is that his voice sounds fairly high-pitched, or not traditionally masculine. We can guess that Paul is around his late teens or early 20s, which is when most people start hormone replacement therapy, or when they start getting injections of the hormone of the gender they're transitioning to. Most other trans guys that I've listened to around that time still have somewhat of a higher-pitched voice like Paul's. Also, the censorship of a lot of things, usually related to care, makes me think of how I try to keep people out of my past of, quote-unquote, when I was a girl, or before I was out. Of course, Paul wouldn't want people all over the internet to see things from his past that would imply that he, quote, was a girl. Thank you, Pete. Barry and L says, honestly, I've been thinking he was care for a long time now. At one point, I brought it up on Reddit only to receive a lot of people who apparently already thought so. Aside from the same birthday as Care and having his room be so closely related to Care's, and all of the other things that lead me to think that he is Care, the quote-unquote girl picture that seems to invoke anxiety, just really resonates with me as someone who can't get away from other people misgendering you, calling you a quote-unquote girl, or using the wrong name. Like, I don't ever make any kind of big deal out of it, but sometimes it's just, that's very much not me. Stop saying that in my head. Or even a wonder, who is that? When people use the wrong pronouns for me. And then I realize who is being talked about is me after some confused deliberation. It just felt very relatable. And then the school counselor is asking about the right name and everything. Even if Paul isn't Care, which I think he is, it's just a really relatable mood. And I'm glad it's not a thing discussed about by the fan base in scorn or in disgust, but in the same way everything else, theory-wise, gets talked about. Quinomatic says, I am trans. I think Paul is trans, if not in actuality, at least metaphorically, like Quentin in The Sound and the Fury, a character that commits suicide and is reborn as a girl. 1. He and Care had the same conversation at one point, establishing a sort of spiritual link between the two. 2. Carrie is abused for her appearance and later vanishes. Trans people often have traumatic feelings about their appearance. This one is kind of tenuous unless we're thinking metaphorically. 3. Carrie is missing and Paul is here playing Petscop, piecing together her life. 4. A lot of the series is focused on rebirthing. I think the final scene shows Carrie being adopted and becoming Paul. That's a kind of rebirth. Why else is Paul getting into a car with Tiara and his mom? The scene sounds like an adoption to me. 5. Some have mentioned that the eggs in the locker are a meld of some characters' assigned colors. Paul and Carrie's colors share an egg, unless I'm misremembering. 6. The sign that says girl has a therapist's office behind it. Brings back memories. That's all I got. I'm honestly wedded to this theory because I like it. Makes me feel good. Thank you, Quinn-O-Matic. Terry H. says, I'm a trans man, and part of the reason Petscop resonated with me is because of how it speaks about identity and certain identities being pushed on you. I like the Paul is trans theory, but even if it's not true, I think the work has interesting points about identity and gender. Well said, thank you, Terry. Dido was Rob says, as a trans man, I appreciate the concept of a trans reading, but I'm wary of the way people have approached it, especially on Reddit. I'd rather embrace the ambiguity of questions of identity with respect to family relationships and time. As someone grows up and takes time on a more intentional or comfortable sense of self, family relations can grow stronger or even more strained, and references to the family being ominous fits with this change, especially since there's such a strong focus on childhood and nostalgia. I can see a trans reading, but questions of general changes in identity and family bonds seem to be more supported by the Petscop text. Dido was Rob, thank you very much. I Am Prinkle says, another trans, non-binary masculine here. My trans woman friend and I really enjoyed the trans reading mostly as a headcanon and because of how much it coincidentally felt similar to the trans experience. Here's some of the stuff we considered. We don't like the weird theory of some kidnapper putting videos online on behalf of their kidnappee. However, the idea of a fucked up conversion therapy style psychologist posting footage seems to make more sense, especially due to the Candace Newmaker parallel, recording Paul's development or lack thereof for quote-unquote research. It also explains Paul's possible trauma and distancing from care. Of course, the gender ambiguous voice, eyebrow growth from T, I assume they mean testosterone. Paul saying he remembers the conversation that Care had, same birthday and all the other stuff that implies they're the same person. Again, I think I prefer to just headcanon this because there's a lot of things that can disprove it. Thank you, I Am Prinkle. Sarcastic Raspberry says, as a trans guy with a lot of trans friends, we have had many times where we remember situations or events with seemingly another quote-unquote person in the memory. It's something of a disassociation tactic that's more troubling than anything. I've had a friend tell me about how they went through a yearbook trying to find their current name and could only find quote-unquote another person with their same last name. And then they thought about it later and went, oh no, that was me, LOL. I myself and some members of my friend group have thought we had another friend in high school because I wasn't out to them at the time. We try to remember the quote-unquote girl we had with us only for us to remember that it was, in fact, me. I bring this up because Paul mentions while watching the quote-unquote party scene in which his avatar is holding a yellow balloon, yellow being assigned to Care, meaning that this is meant to be her. That he, quote-unquote, remembers having that conversation when the avatar in the place of Care talks to who I assume to be her mother. He also says he doesn't remember a girl named Care, but that they are exactly the same age. Also, if Paul was the same age as Care, wouldn't he be included in the list of names of family members at the end of the game? Unless he wasn't out at the time the original list was put in for beta testers, he would have been a child. But he was out when the game was quote-unquote changed while his mom had it. That would be when a new room was added and the distinction from Paul and Care was made. There's also the word girl that seems to haunt the character in the first video with a school level. The school counselor asks if they have the right name and the player is prompted to input their name again. Perhaps the counselor believed Paul was under some distress at home over his identity. This could also explain why Care, in parentheses, Paul's mother, signs the note in the locker in the same manner she did at home, but this time the letter has a more smothering nature behind it. That would be how they felt at the time while exploring their identity. Lastly, it would make sense for Care's mother to have had the game in her care rather than anyone else in the family. Of course, this means a lot for the text and metaphors within. Marvin pushing the player into being quote-unquote care or into being his wife's dead sister could be a metaphor for people in the lives of trans people treating their supposed loved ones as both murderer and victim for quote-unquote taking away the person who they used to be, and in a lot of ways still are. Rebirthing as a process could be the wish to quote-unquote have their child back. The idea that a child is good when they perform to their parents' desires is certainly something trans groups have been pushing against. The very nature that your child could not be the gender they were assigned at birth is a terrifying one for most parents, not just controlling ones. And I think the narrative fits perfectly in the story of Petscop. That was an excellent comment. Thank you, Sarcastic Raspberry. Raynor has smuggled an element of Marvin's abusive pathology, something which was impressed upon his, i.e. Raynor's own psyche, via emotional and perhaps even physical abuse, if not firsthand, then certainly secondhand via Marvin's treatment of care. Consequently, Raynor has inscribed this abusive pathology into the game itself. As I have said previously, Petscop the game is Raynor's impressionistic interpretation of his surroundings, and Raynor's perspective has been shaped by the events in his life, including the turmoil he experienced as a result of Marvin's actions. So, it is sadly the case that in order to understand Raynor, we need to understand Marvin. In a way, this seems like a grave injustice because I think there's a strong case to be made that Marvin was Raynor's abuser, just as he was Care's abuser. Trauma may well have brought them closer together before it drove them apart. Recall that certain notes allude to the possibility that Raynor was once Marvin's accomplice. It is an unpleasant truth that Raynor has been shaped by Marvin, even as Raynor has clearly grown to despise him for what he's done. Nonetheless, the two are linked, and this work cannot be disentangled without scrutinizing their relationship. So again, we need to understand Marvin in order to understand Raynor. In terms of Marvin's function in the work, I think it's fair to say he can be understood primarily as the central antagonist. Let's try to get a handle on his motivations. I'd like to assert that Marvin has a distinctly reactionary disposition. And by reactionary here, I am, of course, referring to the ideology known as reactionary conservatism. Moreover, I'd like to suggest that this is the defining feature of his character. Now, allow me to explain precisely what a reactionary is, because a lot of people get it wildly wrong. A reactionary is not simply, as the label suggests, someone who reacts to things in a knee-jerk manner. It's better to think of reactionary ideology as a tendency, a general attitude towards politics and culture. The important thing to keep in mind is the transition from feudalism to capitalism was not abrupt. It happened over the course of hundreds of years, and some vestiges of feudalism still remain even today. The monarchy in England is a good example of this. Now, there are those who embrace modernity. There are those who critique it while still holding some modern advancements in high regard, and there are those who romanticize previous epochs and perhaps even strive for some kind of return to the perceived traditions of another time. This is the core feature of reactionary ideology, whereas a so-called progressive favors change in a forward trajectory, at least from the perspective of said progressive. The reactionary seeks to effect regressive changes in the social order. Moreover, it's important not to conflate reactionaries with your run-of-the-mill conservatives. By definition, conservatives resist change, but they don't necessarily seek to effect regressive changes. They would, hypothetically speaking, oppose change in that direction as well. In other words, conservatives don't necessarily want to move backwards. Donald Trump is a reactionary, or at the very least, he presents himself as one. Personally, I'm not convinced he has any real convictions. But as we all know, his motto is, "Make America Great Again." There couldn't be a better motto for a reactionary. This dissonance between his personal solipsism and his outward presentation as a reactionary is, I would argue, the definitive quality of a postmodern reactionary, which is not an ethos per se, but rather an aesthetic preference. Right-wing religious fundamentalists are perhaps more authentically reactionary in the modern sense. Mitt Romney, well, he's a bit more of a traditional conservative, and this is perhaps why Romney is one of the few people on the right who vocally criticizes Trump. Traditional conservatives and reactionaries both present their particular dangers to the world, but reactionaries, in my view, tend to be worse. In Petscop, the series, the reactionary ethos is epitomized by the character of Marvin. Time and time again, Marvin displays highly reactionary characteristics. Further, recall that in Petscop 6, Marvin records a message for Paul. He asks, "Where is my house?" and subsequently, "Where is the school?" It's abundantly clear that Marvin wants to instantiate a previous moment in time. Moreover, he's willing to hurt people in order to bring it about. Recall again the message relayed by the pink tool in Petscop 5. Marvin picks up tool, hurts me when PlayStation on. In a certain sense, Marvin is trying to bring the past back to life. He seeks change in the trajectory of regression. He's like a hellish, sadistic version of Jay Gatsby. Instead of throwing lavish parties to try and attract an old flame, Marvin is kidnapping children in order to brainwash them into thinking they're another person entirely. Marvin forces his captive victims to perform elaborate rituals in order to initiate some kind of supernatural transformation, the so-called rebirthing process. This is where nostalgia comes into play yet again. Rayner developed Petscop in part as a response to Marvin's sadistic behavior. So, when Paul asked the tool, "Where is the school?" in reference to Marvin's earlier question, it's important to note the answer that Paul receives. You can't go back in time. This is presumably a message from Rayner intended for Marvin. It's almost like Rayner is taunting him, isn't it? In terms of the work's effects, Petscop employs nostalgia in order to lure the viewer into a false sense of security, and yet the video game uses nostalgia as a weapon. It's precisely here that we see yet again there's a process of formalization at play. I've previously explained formalization, but for our purposes here, I want to understand it as a process whereby the specific form the work assumes also assumes a thematic conceit of the work. The work situates nostalgia in the context of the uncanny, the harsh reality of the world. And by doing so, the work demonstrates that nostalgia can be used in a rather deceptive manner. And yet, nostalgia is precisely what gives this work the power that it does. So rather than render the concept null, say something like, the good old days really weren't all that good, the work instead shows us how our desire for some imagined past plays an active role in shaping our present reality. Petscop, the work, is very concerned with both psychology and systems. We can think of Petscop as both an artful critique of psychoanalysis, or at the very least, a certain thread of psychoanalysis, as well as an artistic synthesis of its most profound insights. I'm sure you've heard of Sigmund Freud, a foundational thinker in the psychoanalytic tradition. Freud came up with the notion of the unconscious, the idea that there exists some mysterious reservoir of thoughts and memories in the human mind, which remains outside of our awareness but nonetheless motivates our behavior. There's a certain sense in which one can draw a direct line from the concept of rebirthing as it was practiced in the case of Candace Newmaker, subsequently leading to her death, and the idea of the unconscious as postulated by Freud himself. That is not to say that I believe there's validity to the concept of rebirthing. not even in a Freudian framework. Rather, I think it's more accurate to consider rebirthing as a troubling outgrowth of Freudian thought in the age of neoliberal hyper-individualism. The idea that one can bring a child who's been diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder into a clinic and put them through some kind of rebirthing process so that they come out the other side a new person, this is a quintessentially American idea. More specifically, it's a perverse sort of reordering of the American dream. So too, can we point to a psychoanalyst whose ideas can be contrasted with that of the theory, or rather, the problematic assumptions upon which the notion of rebirthing was based? Despite what you may have heard about Jacques Lacan, he is a Freudian psychoanalyst whose basic approach would strike most people as fairly pragmatic. He believed that the goal of psychoanalysis is not, as some might naively assume, to cure the patient, to make them a fully realized human being, but rather to help them understand the narrative of their life in such a way that it helps them function. Lacan drew from both Freudian psychoanalysis as well as structural linguistics in order to understand the structure of the unconscious. He argued that the unconscious was structured in a manner similar to that of a language. Contrary to Saussure's notion of the sign, Lacan postulated the signifying chain as the basis upon which a given language is formed. The signifying chain exists to bring about the speaker's unconscious desires to the level of the conscious utterance. Now, if we think of the structure of Petscop the game as an artistic representation of this character Rayner's unconscious, well, some fairly interesting things start to happen. Petscop is, in a sense, a project that seeks to colonize the player's unconscious and imprint on it the dynamic of abuse. Rayner designed it with the aim to accuse Marvin of a heinous crime and subsequently obtain information from him. But when Paul is playing, the question then becomes, what is the effect when the player isn't the accused? That is to say, the player is not Marvin. Regardless of Rayner's intentions, the conceptual map that is drawn for the player contains within it the dynamic of abuse. In Petscop 14, a save file is mysteriously replaced with a file called Strange Situation, which, as I explained in the 5th Petscop investigation, is an explicit reference to an experiment conducted in order to study attachment relationships between caregivers and children. During this procedure, the caregiver and child are placed in an unfamiliar playroom, and then the child is subject to a number of repeated scenarios in which the caregiver leaves the room and a stranger enters. This is similar in a way to what happens in the game itself. Paul gets a black key by painting over the censored item on the wall. He then uses the key to access the upper right-hand corner of the house. The game restarts and Paul finds the Strange Situation file in place of his own save file. In addition, Paul finds that his backup files have been deleted. He is understandably shaken by the predicament.
It deleted my files. I hope it didn't.
In this case, the files that are familiar to Paul have been taken away and an unfamiliar element has been introduced, the Strange Situation. There are a number of things to take away from this reference. For starters, it seems to me that the work is implying that Paul takes refuge in the game, just like a child would seek comfort from a caregiver, often the mother. By taking away Paul's save files, the game has introduced an entire new level of uncertainty. Whereas with previous discoveries, Paul could rest assured that his save files would remain intact. Beyond this point, he is no longer able to remain secure that his progress will be maintained. Insecurity is fostered by giving the player a sense of stability and then pulling the floor out from under them. This is something akin to the type of emotional manipulation that abusers engage in on a regular basis. The psychological aspects of Petscop cannot be emphasized enough. Towards the beginning of this analysis, I briefly mentioned a concept in computer programming known as commenting. This is a fairly easy concept to grasp. It's when programmers mark off a line of code in order to simply write a note to themselves or the other people on their team working on the program. In the past, we have observed scenarios in which it seems that the developer, this so-called Rainer, has written notes to himself in the descriptions of particular so-called pets. However, in programming terms, a comment would not execute in such a way that it presents itself like it has with these various descriptions. Rather, a comment is sectioned off by some indicator. In the case of Python, it's a hashtag for short comments, which tell the program to simply ignore this line. Thus, it's only apparent to those on the back end as opposed to the front-facing side of the program. Conversely, Rainer has left cryptic messages on the front end of the program. If he really wanted to write a note just for himself, he would have done it on the back end. This implies two possible conclusions. The first is that despite the extemporaneous tone and personal nature of these notes, Rainer has left them there intentionally. He wants someone to read them for a specific purpose. The second possibility is simply that he used the specific version of the game we're seeing as something of a diary. He didn't anticipate that anyone else would be reading these notes and possibly intended to remove them at a later date. But good grief and alas, he never got around to it. Or, I guess there's a third implicit conclusion that's somewhere in between these two. It's possible that Rainer intended to use these descriptions as a diary of sorts, but that on a deeper level, he really hoped that someone would get a chance to read them. Perhaps we can consider the descriptions like an unconscious call for help. There exists a compelling institutional critique embedded within Petscop's very skeleton. This is apparent even in the most simple elements of the work. Let's consider, for instance, the fact that every time the player enters the school building, a brick frame appears around the entire screen. School is a constrictive place. It lacks the openness apparent in the rest of the game. However, it should be noted that the brick frame disappears whenever the player clips into a wall or turns at a certain angle. In the fictional universe of Petscop, this is nothing more than a bug. However, is there a symbolic angle to this phenomenon? It seems to me that there are points at which the constrictive nature of the school dissipates, if only for a passing moment. There are points at which we can observe the cracks in the system, the access points, if you will. In these moments, the fallibility of the developer is made abundantly clear. These are the specific moments at which the artifice of the game is palpable. Over the course of this series, the formation of various signifiers begins to weigh heavily on the narrative. One might even say there's a sort of arbitrary complexity which encumbers the viewing experience. At the risk of stating the obvious, this quality is very clearly not a bug, but rather a feature. It's one of many features which, at first glance, appears to be a bug. Overwhelming complexity is one way to subdue or perhaps render complacent individuals within a given system. So too does surveillance play an essential role in perpetuating the game. Rainer has perhaps unwittingly built the ultimate surveillance device, a video game that alludes to the player in a directly personal sense and therefore merits the player's continual engagement and also records all of the player's inputs entirely unbeknownst to the player, provided of course that someone hasn't filled them in. It's important to consider the distinct likelihood that Paul is not playing a game that was intended for him, not personally at least. It is eventually made clear that the game was intended for Marvin. Rainer suspected that Marvin was responsible for Care's disappearance, so he created the creepy part of the game to try and obtain information from him. He figured Marvin would be too smart to fall for this immediately, but also that he'd be curious enough to explore the game, so he created a way of recording the player's inputs. So while it is true that the game records the player's inputs, this mechanism wasn't initially intended to track just any old player. It was intended to track Marvin. Rayner devised an ingenious method to get information out of Marvin without his knowledge. To be sure, this method proved quite fruitful. For instance, during Marvin's gameplay session back in Petscop 20, he begins to ask the tool a question. He enters the words, "Did you dig?" and then decides to ask another question entirely. Did you find Lena? See, Marvin was conscientious enough to know that his choice of words here might end up biting him in the ass, but he was not savvy enough to consider the possibility that Rayner was already tracking his every movement in the game, which, as it turns out, he was. It is clear that Rayner has developed this game, or at least this specific part of the game, as a sort of method to obtain important information from Marvin. But what exactly is the effect of the game when someone other than Marvin is playing? Did Rayner consider that this recording mechanism could be used for nefarious purposes? Let's consider for a moment the notion that Petscop is actually a portmanteau of pets and cop, which almost would be so simple and obvious that it's kind of weird I haven't talked about it yet. I have to admit, whenever I've gotten this comment pointing out this very obvious interpretation, I've gotten into the habit of rolling my eyes because it's a little too on the nose, isn't it? That's how I felt about it, at least. How can a work so enigmatic and inscrutable have a name that's so, well, heavy-handed? But maybe I shouldn't be so dismissive of this interpretation. Let's think about it in terms of the game's parameters. As the quote-unquote new maker, you function as someone who brings various entities into protective custody. However, due to certain malign incentives within the game, you end up perpetuating a cycle of systemic violence. Petscop, the work, isn't focused on the morality of any one individual within the story. To be sure, that's what Rayner was focused on when he created Petscop, but Petscop, the work, is focused on the system itself. I would argue that Petscop, the game, assumes the structure of the virtual rhizome as described by philosopher Gilles Deleuze and the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari. In botanical terms, a rhizome is a modified subterranean plant stem that sends out roots and shoots from its nodes. They grow underground or sometimes at ground level. Rhizomes are sometimes referred to as creeping rootstocks. In philosophical terms, the rhizome is considered both a mode of knowledge and a model for society itself. It's a structure which is said to have no beginning and no end, conventionally speaking. We must distinguish the rhizomatic from its counterpart, the arborescent, whose structure you might find a bit more intuitive. As its name suggests, the arborescent is that which assumes the structure of a tree. The decision tree, which is a kind of precursor to the algorithm, is, for instance, considered arborescent. A decision tree has a more conventionally logical form than a rhizome. It's hierarchical in nature. While a decision tree is more prone to operate on binary logic, a rhizome, in Deleuze's terms, is said to, quote-unquote, apprehend multiplicities. It operates by the conjunction and. I would argue that the game assumes the form of the rhizome primarily by establishing connections between various semiotic chains. For instance, conditions in one area of the game can have an effect on conditions in another part. The basis of the relationship between these areas is signaled to the player through the use of various signifiers. To be sure, there is no signified to which these symbols can be reasonably associated. In other words, there's no point in the series where we find out these signifiers refer to some deeper meaning, such as, for instance, death, murder, or perhaps the precise relationship between characters in the series. Rather, various parts in the game are associated with one another through the implied connections suggested by these signifiers. Let's take some time to flesh out the conceptual apparatus that constitutes the overall structure of the game. Since we know very little about the language by which Petscop was programmed, I'd like to try and review these various elements not in terms of their formal structure, but rather as the player experiences them. That is to say, as phenomena in the gameplay sessions made available to us. The gift plane can be understood as the surface level of Petscop, in which entities known as pets are obtained by solving various puzzles. Likewise, Evencare is the building in which pets are obtained. The so-called Newmaker plane is the subsurface, the point at which signifiers become ominous, but not explicit. It's where the windmill disappears and reappears, and it's where the so-called frozen house exists in 3 states, presumably 3 distinct points in time. The area below the Newmaker plane is even further down, the subsurface, if you will. Perhaps it would be more apt to say it's subterranean. This is where the implicit, ominous signifiers become explicit. But there is yet another level to consider, and that is the level of the reality in which Petscop, the work, takes place. What if we consider this to be yet another level of the game? Just as certain conditions in the gift plane have an effect on the subsurface, aspects of this reality in which Petscop takes place have the potential to affect the environment of the game. In Deleuze's concept of the rhizome, the diversity of things which can be said to belong to the rhizome might strike some as a bit counterintuitive. In the case of so-called virtual rhizomes, Deleuze states that both organic and inorganic elements may belong to the underlying structure. In Petscop, we need to understand the player as a distinct but mutually dependent part of the larger structure of the game. Even things that seem at first tangentially related can be considered to be contingent parts of the rhizome, provided that they have the potential to have an effect on the larger structure. For instance, Paul reprimands his cat at one point in the course of his gameplay in Petscop 14. In this case, the cat has done something to impact the sequence of events, since it has caused the player to become distracted. Not only does this impact Paul's immediate gameplay session, it also impacts the demo sequence depicted in that video, and it impacts any player who uses that recording for their own purposes, whatever they may be, later on. Petscop requires the player to continually work through increasingly complex puzzles. In Petscop 13, the game is described as a growing organism. The player is then told, your controller inputs will be useful, but your feedback will be even more useful. Consider the idea that feedback here is not meant in the sense that testers are going to be relaying their thoughts on the game, but rather that the player's actions will produce a type of feedback effect. They each play their respective role in perpetuating the game. Later in Petscop 19, the pause screen displays a message for a very brief moment. There are no changes, only replacements. Only now, upon completion of the series, can we start to make sense of what that really means. We need to think about Petscop in terms of what actually drives the player to continue playing. As long as the player is playing Petscop, Petscop is perpetuating itself. In the initial stage of the process, it's simple enough. Paul acquires items known as pieces throughout the game, yet it's important to note that he does so without direct knowledge of what these so-called pieces are going to be used for. He simply acquires them because that's what you do in these types of games. It starts as an end in and of itself. Paul never really acknowledges this activity. As I've previously stated, Paul comes to associate the visuals and sound effects of piece acquisition with some vague notion of progress. Pieces signify a new portion of the game. Moreover, they correspond with in-game events which gradually feed Paul information. In turn, the game feeds on his intellectual curiosity. Without this incentive, Paul very likely would have stopped playing this game a few minutes after he started. For Paul, progress is synonymous with knowledge. Of course, whenever I use the word progress in this context, you have to understand that I'm using it in quotes. We don't actually know for sure that the further Paul works his way into the recesses of this video game, the more knowledge he will acquire. We are, however, clued into another potential objective. We are told in Petscop 7 that the character known as Marvin requires 1,000 pieces for the, quote, machine beyond the school basement stairway. It's at this point that a concrete goal is established. We later find out that this machine is essential for the rebirthing process. So, this whole time, Paul has been taking part in an activity that he hasn't even fully understood. Puzzles are yet another mechanism that drives the player to continue playing. For a certain kind of person, solving puzzles can be, well, gratifying. It can make you feel like the world makes sense, even if only just for a passing moment. Some semblance of order has been achieved. Things have been put in their proper place, so to speak. In Petscop, the act of solving puzzles is subject to a fetishization process. In other words, solving puzzles becomes something other than simply solving puzzles. For Paul, it means progress. It means he'll be given more ominous little tidbits of information. Starting with the very first part of the game, Paul is trained to solve puzzles through an elaborate process of conditioning. In part 5 of my investigation, I speculated about the possibility of these puzzles actually extending into the real world in which Petscop takes place. This may well be the reason we hear a car door open and close. The insinuation is, of course, that Paul is out there trying to solve puzzles in the real world. So, video games are supposed to be fun, right? And yet, it seems as though Paul is increasingly dissatisfied with his gameplay experience. For Paul, Petscop is very often a frustrating experience. Yet, there's no point at which we, the viewers, are explicitly told that he's decided to stop. What then accounts for his willingness to continue despite this continual frustration? Well, it should be kept in mind that at various points, it doesn't exactly seem like Paul is playing entirely on his own accord. Over the course of the series, Paul's YouTube channel is appropriated by the so-called family, a group of people I have continually referred to as the proprietors. There are only vague allusions to Paul having an issue with some arrangement he's made with this so-called family. Nonetheless, there's a clear sense in which Paul is alienated from the work he performs in the video game. In turn, Paul exercises some degree of agency by choosing not to reveal certain findings to the family. Consider this scene in Petscop 22 in which Paul happens upon a set of coordinates.
It's exciting. This is why I'm not telling the family, because it's exciting.
Nonetheless, we can recognize that what we are viewing in, for instance, Petscop 22, is actually a recording from the game itself. Thus, it's clear that the so-called family has already been apprised of this information by the time we are seeing it. We can recognize within the protagonist's experience the common struggle of certain workers in so-called post-industrial countries, areas in which the ethos of office bureaucracy and the culture of middle management often reigns supreme. Likewise, Paul performs a number of rote tasks in service of the game's completion at the behest of this family. A lot of his gameplay experience entails retreading old ground, repeating the same motions in another context, etc. To be sure, Paul does a fair amount of intellectual work. It is abundantly clear that this game requires a special kind of highly abstract set of reasoning abilities. This is in part the lure for Paul. This game is a real challenge for him, but there's another incentive as well. See, what ends up happening is Paul is given various bits of information which seem to imply a very dark truth about his family. And so he's compelled to move forward in order to learn this truth. And yet, he knows all too well that Petscop was not designed for him personally. It is strongly implied that the darker portions of the game are intended for Marvin. Yet, I wonder, is there a danger in the simple act of playing this game? Not just any video game, this one in particular, Petscop. Just as it's essential to understand Petscop in terms of what motivates the player to continue playing, so too is it essential to think about what Petscop the game transforms the player into over the course of the player's gameplay experience. What is the player at the start of Petscop? What does the player become? Is there a risk that Paul might somehow have internalized the various horrific occurrences alluded to throughout the game? Is there a risk that he might come to believe things that aren't true simply by virtue of something he's internalized from a video game? There's a famous quote attributed to both philosopher Slavoj Žižek and the literary critic Frederick Jameson, which goes as follows. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. This is a statement that the late critical theorist Mark Fisher ruminated on in his book Capitalist Realism, in which he argued that capitalism had pervaded our psyches to such a degree that we've become ideologically paralyzed, unable to conceive of the possibility of another system. Now, for those of you who roll your eyes every time I bring up politics and socioeconomics, well, first off, I'm kind of surprised you're still here, but nonetheless, I implore you to bear with me because what I'm really concerned with here is the nature of systems and the effect they have on the psyche of individuals. And I promise you, this is immediately relevant to Petscop, perhaps more so than you imagine. So fucking pay attention, all right? We have observed certain behavioral patterns throughout the various game sessions that constitute Petscop. The tendency for the game to contain puzzles which seem to be coded in a certain bizarre manner gives rise to actions on the part of the player. I think it's fair to say the game encourages the player to employ a certain twisted form of logic. But what is the basis for this logic? How does it take shape? Recall the previous statement. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Why does this sentiment resonate to the degree that it has been brought up time and time again by thinkers in the realm of politics and philosophy? What is really being said here? One basic insight of Marx is that human beings develop through the social relations they take part in. I think you'll find it's helpful in this context when we extrapolate some of the broader implications of this idea. You see, the way work is arranged in a capitalist society creates a kind of unique separation between commodities and the workers that play an essential role in their production. Therefore, capitalism entails a distinct kind of separation between human beings, ourselves, and one another. And importantly, this abstract separation is continually reinforced through the social practice of exchanging commodities. Marx argued that the emergence of capitalism as the prevailing mode of production had spurred a system consisting of material relations between people and social relations between things. In capitalism, the social character of work is largely de-emphasized since the nature of work in a capitalist system is essentially based on material relations. Conversely, you can think of socialized labor like a large extended family all helping out in order to produce a nice Thanksgiving dinner for themselves. Of course, this is a somewhat reductive example, so bear with me. Compare this social arrangement, the family members all doing their respective parts to make a nice Thanksgiving dinner, to the capitalist mode of production, whereby the capitalist pays the worker an hourly wage for their labor and then sells the product of their labor for a profit. Since the worker doesn't own the product of their labor, since they don't control what happens to that product, they in turn become alienated from it. Their labor, I mean. Workers in capitalism are subject to a material relation that is contingent upon their own exploitation. Without the exploitation of labor, the ability to generate profits disappears. The prevalence or ubiquity of this general arrangement has widespread effects in all spheres of life. For instance, the average consumer in the capitalist system is often totally alienated from the origins of the various commodities they buy in the marketplace. And as the system inevitably falls into crisis, it tends to massively disrupt the social order of things. All of these strange effects occur as a result of capitalism's definitive qualities. In the very beginning of Capital, Volume 1, Marx sets out to describe the commodity as it is generally understood in the framework of capitalism. In the capitalist system, goods are sold in the marketplace for a profit. These goods are referred to as commodities. Importantly, labor power is also a commodity in the capitalist framework. The commodity form necessarily entails a certain degree of abstraction. This is what Marx referred to as the fetish character of commodities, perhaps more commonly known as the commodity fetish. In capitalism, the consumer doesn't directly see the labor that goes into the production of any given commodity. They only experience the commodity in the marketplace. The price of a commodity is a representation of the labor that went into making it. But of course, that doesn't mean that it is the labor. Rather, the price of a commodity stands in for the labor, just like the signifier in structural linguistics stands in for the signified. So the exchange value of a commodity is an abstraction. It doesn't matter whether or not you realize the abstract nature of the commodity form. Even if you understand commodity fetishism for what it is, the relation is still continually embodied in your social practices. In his various speaking engagements, Zizek continually brings up an anecdote involving the famous quantum physicist Niels Bohr. Bohr reportedly kept a horseshoe above his doorway to keep evil spirits away. When a friend said to him, "Why does a man of science such as yourself take part in this ridiculous superstition?" Bohr replied, "Of course, I don't actually believe in it. However, I was told it works even if you don't believe in it." You see, this dissonance is the space where modern ideology truly operates. I've previously stated that Paul's employment of the sort of trial and error process, which one might associate with modern science, is perhaps misleading. At face value, it lends a certain credence to the idea that he's a reliable narrator. To be sure, Paul's meticulous exploration of the game allows us to better understand its machinations. However, it should be noted that Paul's quasi-scientific attitude towards the game, his disbelief in the possibility of a so-called entity inhabiting Petscop, he nonetheless continually plays it as though the consequences of doing so are effectual in his reality, and perhaps even dire. Paul is not simply an observer, someone studying Petscop with a dispassionate scientific perspective. When it comes to Petscop, this position is impossible to achieve since the game itself explicitly references the player. Rather, Paul is an active participant. He's a genre-savvy protagonist who nonetheless finds himself within the confines of a work in the horror genre, the creepypasta. The simple fact that he realizes this does not change the fact that he must adhere to specific conventions in order to continue making progress within the game. One might even say that Paul's dispassionate scientism functions as a kind of defense mechanism, which nonetheless serves the underlying function of the player in the system that constitutes Petscop. In other words, it's something that makes him feel more comfortable moving forward despite some fairly obvious red flags. And so this attitude is recuperated, in a manner of speaking, by the underlying ideology, that which perpetuates Petscop. I have previously stated that Petscop depicts a strange sort of interplay between surface and subsurface. Indeed, the impression of Rayner's world is at first one of duality. From the very start, there is an observable contrast between the bright, cheery artifice of the gift plane and the desolate emptiness and implied trauma of the Newmaker plane. Nonetheless, the two worlds are mysteriously connected through the use of symbols and strange, convoluted mechanics, which I have explained to the best of my abilities in previous videos. So too have I previously drawn a parallel between the duality in Petscop and certain economic conditions in the United States during the late 90s. Stated briefly, while by certain accounts the 90s coincided with a time of vast economic growth, the lower strata of society did not enjoy the fruits of this growth. They continued to suffer from the effects of poverty and alienation, while a small handful of wealthy elites captured the vast majority of wealth created during this time. Some have considered this rather straightforward observation to be outside the scope of a Petscop analysis, but I for one think it's immediately relevant to this idea that underneath the surface of everyday life, there exists a subsurface in which the inner workings are laid bare. You see, what exists at the level of subtext in the gift plane exists at the level of text in the subterrestrial portion of the game. Whereas in the gift plane, dehumanization is only referenced implicitly via subtle changes to a certain sign, it is explicitly referenced in the underground portion. Recall the line, "Child library accepts people." Here we have the casual bureaucratization of childcare, an understanding of people as mere objects which can be deposited and withdrawn at a moment's whim. The surface depicts the childlike version of things. The horrific truths of the world have been erased, save for a few hints here and there. In contrast, the area below is practically teeming with dark secrets, sinister plans, and these four words: good grief and alas. Alas, I should note here, is a word with a few potential connotations, foremost of which in my mind is this one: an exclamation used to express the apprehension of evil. These words, taken from a children's book, are plastered across the wall in the area to the left of the so-called child library, which we are told only accepts people. This is a place where subtext becomes text, evil becomes explicit. In light of the abstract valence of the commodity form, it absolutely must be noted that children in Petscop are continually thought of as abstractions by those who wish to use them for their own purposes. You might even say that children are subject to an elaborate and absolutely ruthless process of commodification in the game itself. Or rather, it's perhaps more accurate to say that the model of parenthood and or guardianship evinced by Petscop, the work, is one that has been imprinted with the commodity form. The value of children in terms of their utility in this elaborate game is just one side of the coin. It's not the entire story, and my understanding of the work would not be sufficiently Marxian if we just left it at that. It's important to remember that the commodity form is not merely one that hinges upon use value. Rather, the commodity is valued precisely in terms of what it can be exchanged for in the marketplace. For Marvin, the abuser, care holds some sort of cult value. Marvin values care on account of her potential to be reborn as Lena, provided that all of the necessary steps are taken. To be sure, this is a very twisted line of thought, and it's not one that is ever explicitly assumed by our protagonist. For Paul, care is simply an item in the game that can be utilized to make progress. There's an unspoken step between the transformation from cult value to utility value. Rayner, the developer, had to inscribe that dynamic in the game. He had to make it possible to deposit a person in the so-called child library. He had to make it so that the player could access Care's room, provided that the appropriate facial features were entered in the painting system. Needless to say, the logic by which this process takes place is fundamentally twisted, but it's only by stopping and taking a moment to question the inner workings of this system that one can arrive at such a conclusion. It's only by asking the question, what conditions must be in place for this logic to come about, that we're able to string together the insidious nature of Petscop. If one were to operate purely by the logic of the system, as Paul has for the majority of his gameplay experience, all would appear to be completely functional. Petscop is an impressionistic view of the commodity form as it invades the family environment. The logic of the market extends into other areas. In Petscop, children aren't understood as what they are, people. Rather, they are objects to either be used in order to achieve a certain goal or exchanged for the purpose of obtaining some kind of surplus. And it's precisely in understanding what this surplus is that one really begins to understand what the work as a whole is doing in terms of its ability to generate horror. The surplus is simply new iterations of the game, new content reassembled and recombined from pre-existing assets within the game, new recordings, new inputs, new data. Without these things, Petscop as we know it would cease to exist. The system of Petscop is driven by player activity, and player activity is driven by certain incentives within the system. And at a certain point, it would appear that Petscop is growing for its own sake. This is the aforementioned feedback loop. One of the more understated themes of Petscop is the atomization of the family unit. Atomization occurs when members of the family become hyper-individuated and their respective self-interests clash. In Petscop, this is brought about by the gradual marketization and commodification of children. In the real world, this is an unfortunate consequence of the expansion and acceleration of capitalism. There's a sense in which the series very much entails an observable disintegration of familial relations. The precise nature of these relations aren't all that clear to start out with, and by the time that it's thoroughly spelled out for us, the information presented is immediately called into question. Recall the line, "I know what you must be thinking." Have these statements always been true? Or have I cursed you? Is there such a thing? A curse that changes your past? I will assert here that yes, there is such a thing as a curse that changes your past. That curse is called ideology. Say it with me. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. In the case of Petscop, the game, I think a similar statement might hold true. It is easier to imagine the player's death than it is to imagine the final completion of the game, Petscop. You see, Petscop's work is never finished. It was always already both an unfinished work and a growing organism, so to speak. Petscop demonstrates how certain ideas are enacted in a virtual space. Viewers have the benefit of being able to continually review the series. They have the benefit of pausing the video and contemplating each moment. Paul, our protagonist, is not in this position. In order to make progress in the game, the player must employ a certain kind of twisted logic repeatedly. I have called attention to this perverse form of conditioning numerous times throughout the course of my investigation. The player has to continually recreate the conditions that allowed the logic to propagate in the first place. They have to either continue the process or stop playing the game entirely. I will assert here that the primary novelty of the game Petscop is that one engages in this process of commodification regardless of their true intentions. The player becomes complicit by virtue of making progress in the game. In some sense, Petscop the game is an apt metaphor to represent the way ideology operates in late capitalism. What I believe we have in the case of Petscop is the emergence of a new form of storytelling, one particular to the dawn of the 21st century. It reflects the arbitrary complexity brought about by the internet and other forms of modern technology. It is contingent upon pre-existing mediums, the epistolary novel, the video game, the YouTube video, specifically the Let's Play format, and of course, the creepypasta. There are, of course, notable precursors to the emergence of Petscop. The video game Yume Nikki, for example, depicts a fantastical dream world of a young girl. Then, of course, there's the Lisa series, not to mention Undertale. As with Petscop, each of these aforementioned games have garnered their own respective cult followings. In hindsight, their lack of mainstream success was something of an inevitability, because contained within these works is two distinct qualities: ambiguity and complexity, conceptual hurdles, as it were, for the audience. The same is essentially true of Petscop. To clarify, this doesn't necessarily mean that viewers who don't appreciate said works are not intelligent, and in turn, it doesn't necessarily mean that those who find themselves to be a part of this niche audience are intelligent. There are many factors that contribute to a person's artistic sensibilities, and it's fairly clear to me that mainstream audiences are fully capable of appreciating works that exhibit ambiguity and complexity. The second golden age of television brought about The Sopranos, 6 Feet Under, The Wire, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, and yes, despite what you may think of how it ended, Game of Thrones. These works often contained long, drawn-out story arcs, morally ambiguous characters, and nuanced critiques of systemic injustice. But Petscop is different. I don't mean to say it's better, necessarily. This is clearly an apples and oranges situation, but nonetheless, it's markedly different. What sets Petscop apart from anything else I've come across is its formal complexity, and indeed, its formal ambiguity. There's something else I feel obligated to address before wrapping up. A common criticism I've heard of my investigation series is that I believe the message of Petscop is simply capitalism bad. For those of you who mischaracterize my arguments in this way, I'd like to formulate a response. I'll just say right off the bat, it's a straw man argument. I don't believe in the type of moralism in which one is expected to renounce entire economic systems without first understanding their historical origins or, for that matter, how they actually work. Rather, I subscribe to the basic Marxian insight that capitalism was a necessary step in the transition to socialism. To be sure, I do believe this mode of production has outlived its usefulness and it needs to be done away with at this point. But it's a bit more complicated than simply writing capitalism off as totally evil. At any rate, there's a much larger problem with this assessment, and it has to do with my view of the function of art in contemporary society. It kind of goes with the territory of being a YouTuber that my arguments are often mischaracterized, but nonetheless, it's worth at least trying to combat this activity. I have never made the claim that Petscop communicates a coherent, overarching message. Not once. In fact, towards the latter part of my investigation, I repeatedly said Petscop is not a puzzle to be solved. It's not something you can distill a coherent, singular message out of without being criminally reductive. And more to the point, this is a mischaracterization of the way art works. I mean, not to get too caught up in semantics here, but art is not propaganda. It demystifies rather than telegraphing a clear message. It's up to us to interpret. And when we use the word communicate, it refers to two or more parties conveying messages to one another in such a way that we know the messages have been received, because we get some sort of acknowledgement or reciprocity. But I don't believe art communicates with us in such a clear and direct way like that. Engaging with art is always an interpretive exercise. It allows you to come to your own conclusions rather than directly telling you what to think. And I believe Petscop excels in its capacity to demystify some of the contradictions of our current moment, which just so happens to be a time utterly dominated by the overarching schema of global capitalism. And so Petscop just so happens to lend itself to an anti-capitalist analysis. But that doesn't mean the work can only be described in those terms. I mean, there's a way in which Petscop also lends itself to an existential reading. After all, it seems to me that Paul has found himself caught up in a decades-long conflict that he himself cannot begin to comprehend. The root of this conflict is not entirely unknown, although the specific details remain artfully obscured from us. And yet, isn't this in a way the very scenario in which we all find ourselves? I mean, this applies to whatever ideological framework you employ. Most people are wrapped up in larger struggles that they themselves do not fully comprehend. But just as there is not one singular coherent message in the work, per se, I will also assert here that there is not a central mystery to solve in the Petscop series. Rather, what we have here is an abstract composition, one which depicts various things: horrific occurrences, coercion, ideological indoctrination, a dysfunctional suburban family falling into ruin, perhaps what we would call criminal acts, but also, well, a redemptive gift of sorts. I guess you could call it a gift. It really depends on your perspective. Petscop artfully demonstrates how we all continually reproduce reality every day. Most of the time we do so unwittingly, but every now and then I don't think it's too much to expect each of us to actively take part in this process of synthesis, or perhaps it would be better to say social reproduction. Petscop asks us to illuminate the subsurface, to shed light on what occurs outside the bounds of normative recognition. While it is certainly true that the past animates the present, and we tend to recreate certain norms in everyday life, and while it's also true that some of these norms are perhaps ill-conceived and in some cases really quite twisted, I believe it's absolutely critical to recognize that we also have the distinct ability to challenge these norms and make something completely new. But is it really possible not to continually retread the past? How can we manage not to close the loop in Petscop's terms, but rather to create a new loop entirely? One which takes into account the woeful inadequacies of the previous loop. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Again, if you enjoy my videos and have a few bucks to spare, you can support me for as little as $1 a month on Patreon. And of course, if you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can do so by going to ko-fi.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Thank you for watching, and good night.